IBESS, Soil and Terrestrial Food Production, Part 9, will examine the sustainability of terrestrial food production systems. The essential idea is the sustainability of terrestrial food production systems is influenced by socio-political, economic, and ecological factors. The ideas presented in this movie will feel very familiar to you. Your challenge is to synthesize and make connections among the various concepts presented throughout this course and within the terrestrial food production unit itself. Here is the first of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. The reference to this movie can be found on the next slide. Here is the second of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is here. Here is the IB syllabus statement that kicks off this movie. As the human population grows, along with urbanization and degradation of soil resources, the availability of land for food production decreases. So how do we sustainably produce food? An agricultural system has the purpose of maximizing production while reducing the inputs. The inputs to an agricultural system will vary depending on whether the farm is typical of a more economically developed country, an MEDC, or a less economically developed country. If the input seeds are GMOs, then the crop is likely to be a monoculture of low diversity and not very stable. If the inputs are inorganic fertilizers, the soil is receiving chemical nutrients but not receiving the structure provided by manure. This lowers sustainability. If the inputs are herbicides and pesticides in high quantities, do these chemicals become part of the output in the form of pollution? Also not very sustainable. Now, if the outputs have a negative effect on the environment, the farm is not sustainable. Consider the degradation of soil through overuse or erosion. Consider pollution, fertilizers and farm runoff, eutrophication, pesticides leaching into the groundwater, herbicides or hormones entering the human food chain, or the processing of food that requires the combustion of fossil fuels. None of this is very sustainable. The world's population is growing. More people means more food must be produced. How do we produce more food? Do we bring more land under cultivation, marginal land? Do we use novel techniques for growing more food in a square meter? Do we waste less of the food that we already produce? Do we all choose to eat less, thus extending the food that we already produce? Or do we all choose to eat less meat? If the human population continues to grow, putting pressure on food production systems, do we bring more land or marginal land under cultivation? Do we use novel techniques for growing more food in a square meter of land? Do we waste less of the food that we already produce? Do we choose to eat less, thus extending the food we already produce? Do we all choose to eat less meat? As the human population grows, the quantity of arable land per person, per capita, decreases. Do we push into marginal lands? Soil conservationists would say that we should not use marginal lands to grow food. The per capita arable land decreased from 1965 to 2005. In 1965, there were 0.39 acres of arable land per person, but in 2005, there were only 0.22 acres of arable land per person. The amount of arable land is a fixed quantity, while human populations have grown. Urbanization and the degradation of soil resources have decreased the availability of land for food production. Increased urbanization worldwide has reduced available land for food production. The use of marginal lands for growing food might allow for more food, but soil conservationists warn that this is not sustainable. Locations of high population density and/or low productivity, such as low rainfall, have a high or medium food security risk. Locations of high population density and/or low productivity have a high food security risk, especially as the climate changes. So that brings us to this IB syllabus statement. The sustainability of terrestrial food production systems is influenced by factors such as scale, industrialization, mechanization, fossil fuel use, seed, crop, and livestock choices, water use, fertilizers, pest control, pollinators, antibiotics, legislation, levels of commercial versus subsistence food production. As you consider agricultural sustainability, remember the various farm types. Industrial farms operate on a large scale with high inputs of mechanization and fossil fuels. Food production is aimed at profit, often through export. Traditional farms operate on a smaller scale with low mechanization and low fossil fuel use. The seeds planted are often indigenous seeds. The traditional farm is more sustainable than the industrial commercial farm. Industrial commercial farms have certain characteristics. They're typically a monoculture, low diversity, with hybrid seeds or GMO crops. They're large scale for profit, often through export, high mechanization, large deforested areas to make room for the crops. These characteristics make industrial farms less sustainable than traditional farms. Industrial commercial farms operate on a large scale. Consider the scale of habitat lost to serve the need of industrial agriculture. Industrial farms are highly mechanized, employing tillers and harvesters and planters. Machines and large areas of land are required for the machines to be cost-effective. Machines require a high input of fossil fuel, resulting in pollution. Now let me pause to add this statement. Evaluate strategies to increase sustainability in terrestrial food production. I will work to add evaluative statements from here on. For example, small-scale farm is a strategy to increase sustainability. Yes, but would production be as high? This is your evaluative statement. Could GMO crops be a strategy to increase sustainability? Yes, GMO crops might allow farmers to use less pesticides, but GMO crops encourage a monoculture, decreasing diversity and decreasing sustainability. Industrial commercial farms often use irrigation water drawn from the groundwater. Groundwater does not replenish quickly. Groundwater depletion is a significant issue worldwide. Industrial agriculture that relies on groundwater irrigation is not sustainable. Strategy: use less groundwater. Evaluation: the production of crops might be less. Global inorganic chemical fertilizer use is in excess of 200 million tons. Industrial farms use inorganic fertilizer because the soil loses nutrients whenever crops are harvested and sold elsewhere. But fertilizers applied in excess run off into rivers and oceans, initiating eutrophication and dead zones. Is this sustainable? Pesticides are released into the environment and enter the food chain. Is this sustainable? Fertilizers and pesticides are expensive inputs, more likely to be used on industrial farms rather than traditional farms. I've repeatedly emphasized that industrial farms employ a single species on a large scale designed for commercial export for profit. The diversity of the system is very low because the system is a monoculture of one species, and this makes the system unstable because if disturbed, all individuals are negatively affected together. There is no stability in a system of low diversity. The same holds true for animal farms. Often our animal farms operate in very high densities. The possible spread of disease requires farmers to use antibiotics. The release of antibiotics into the environment is resulting in antibiotic-resistant species. This is unsustainable. The high levels of pollution from the industrial farm makes the industrial farm less sustainable than the traditional farm. But be specific if asked about pollution, fertilizers in the runoff, pesticides in the food chain, carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. On the industrial farm, soil degradation is a problem, but be specific if asked about soil degradation. Erosion, and can you explain it? Desertification, and can you explain it? Toxification, salinization. Review movies 2 and 3 in this unit if these soil degradation issues are not familiar to you. Every aspect of industrial food production is not sustainable, from the feedlots to the plastic packaging. Only people in MEDCs can afford food processed like this. Does this look like sustainable food production to you? And how far away will these foods be shipped from where they were grown to where they're purchased? And don't forget, all food is grown on land somewhere. Net production on land somewhere in the world. While it might make economic sense, does it make sense to ship food thousands and thousands of miles just to meet the demands of wealthy customers? Subsistence or traditional farming results in the minimum income needed for subsistence. The food is grown for local consumption. This is sustainable farming for all of the obvious reasons. On traditional farms, the expensive inputs, machines, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, irrigation water, GMO seeds, are low. Thus, sustainability is high. So that brings us to this IB syllabus statement, which is really a series of statements. Increased sustainability may be achieved through, first, altering human activity to reduce meat consumption and increase consumption of organically grown and locally produced food products. Secondly, improving the accuracy of food labels to assist consumers in making informed choices. Thirdly, the need to monitor and control the standards and practices of multinational and national food corporations, and this should be done by governmental and intergovernmental organizations. Fourth, planting of buffer zones around land suitable for food production to absorb nutrient runoff. And lastly, reducing food waste. Let's take a look at each of these statements. How can societies alter human behavior to reduce meat consumption? Eating lower on the food chain reduces one's environmental impact. Eating lower on the food chain increases food availability. This increases sustainability. When societies eat lower on the food chain, less deforestation occurs to provide pasture for grazing animals. Less water is used to irrigate the pasture land for grazing animals. Fewer hormones or antibiotics enter the environment. By eating lower on the food chain, there's more plant food for people because animal respiration reduces what's potentially available. Remember the second law of thermodynamics that accounts for the shape of every energy pyramid. Always remember trophic level efficiency in eating lower on the food chain. The yield of food per unit area from lower trophic levels is greater in quantity, lower in cost, and may require fewer resources. The livestock industry accounts for 21% of the greenhouse gases produced by humans. Producing a half a kilogram of beef creates the same amount of greenhouse gases as driving 100 kilometers. A cow produces 100 kilograms of methane annually. Methane is a greenhouse gas. The amount of carbon dioxide per kilogram of product is far higher in meat production than in plant production. Spend some time studying this graph. Campaigns such as the concept of Meatless Monday aims to change human behavior. Changing human behavior is not easy. People are reluctant to change, but it can be done through education and awareness campaigns. Going meatless every Monday for a year would result in fewer greenhouse gases, the equivalent of taking 240 million cars off the road. As we consider our choices in food, maybe we should think about the intrinsic rights of all species. Certain NGOs are committed to protecting rainforests. We need to ensure that societies are not removing rainforest to grow grazing pasture for animals. Is the meat you eat grown on pasture that once supported a rainforest? Sustainable food production means to increase consumption of organically grown and locally produced food products. If societies eat local products, the release of greenhouse gases is reduced. By choosing local products, societies release less greenhouse gases. Moving food by air results in the highest release of carbon dioxide per ton of food per kilometer traveled. Only economics allows some of us in MEDCs to eat an apple from Australia in the middle of the winter. Is this a sustainable food choice? Choosing to eat organic foods would be more sustainable because, well, you can see the reasons in the definition of organic. It's food grown without the use of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or genetically modified organisms. Organic animals that produce meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy do not take antibiotics or growth hormones. Improving the accuracy of food labels to assist consumers in making informed choices would increase sustainability. Sustainability would be improved with monitoring and control of the standards and practices of multinational and national food corporations, and this monitoring could be done by governmental or intergovernmental organizations. Too often, multinational food companies have profit as their driving force rather than sustainability. Sustainability would be improved with monitoring and control of the standards and practices of multinational and national food corporations, and the monitoring could be done by governmental or intergovernmental organizations. Too often, multinational food companies have profit as their driving force rather than sustainability. And lastly, on the list of statements that would increase food sustainability, let's look at planting of buffer zones around land suitable for food production to absorb nutrient runoff, and let's look at reducing food waste. Sustainability of food production would be improved by planting buffer zones around land growing food to absorb fertilizer runoff. You can see a buffer zone of plant growth between the edge of the farm and the ditch that carries water. In the aerial photo on the right, you can see the buffer zone of vegetation that protects the river from excess fertilizer that might otherwise run off the field into the river. Sustainability of food production would be improved by planting buffer zones around the land that's growing food to absorb fertilizer runoff before the excess fertilizer reaches the waterway, before the excess fertilizer results in eutrophication. This diagram nicely displays the buffer zone of vegetation that surrounds the pond. The buffer zone absorbs the excess fertilizers that might run off from the farm field into the pond. In this way, our waterways are protected from the negative effects of eutrophication. In this photo, you can see the buffer zone here. And lastly, the sustainability of food production can be increased by reducing food waste. Why do societies throw so much food away? Could this food have been eaten, thus reducing the need to grow more food in the first place? In MEDCs, the food waste originates as consumer waste because of regulatory standards, hygiene standards that require the food to be discarded rather than eaten. In LEDCs, the food waste originates from spoilage. Spoilage because of improper refrigeration or poor transportation infrastructure. As well, many LEDCs are located in tropical regions where warm, wet conditions serve decomposers well. This slide shows you the amount of food waste in millions of tons by region. And what's interesting is that all of the food waste in Asia is equal to all of the food that the U.S. grows in wheat, corn, and soybean. In other words, the total amount of these three crops produced yearly in the U.S. is equivalent to a full year of food waste in all of Asia. Now, the National Resource Defense Council puts a striking figure on the actual statistics, suggesting that we waste 40% of all food produced. The average American discards 33 pounds of food each month. And MSNBC calculates that each person is responsible for throwing out an adult gorilla's weight in food each year. That's a lot of food. Sustainability of food production can be increased by reducing food waste. Think how many people could be fed from what we throw away. And that brings us to the end of Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Systems, Part 9.